I hope that over the next couple of days that I get a chance just to interact with some of you. I've already got to talk with a couple of you individually and personally. But as we get to know each other over the next couple of days, I want to go ahead and just tell you a little bit more about me on the personal side before we get into all of our information for the next few sessions. And so I want to introduce you guys to my family. I will tell you a little bit about how my wife and I met. I was involved in a church flag football league, tore my ACL, and my wife was the girl behind the counter. And so I went to the physical therapy office, and she saw something she could not refuse and began inviting me to church with her. And to make a long story short, we've been married for 10 and a half years now. We were actually both in a relationship for 4 years before we met each other. And we like to say that we are the world's most successful rebound because we are still going strong after 10 years. We have a little boy together named Caleb. Caleb is 8 years old, and we have a little dog named Raider, who's also one of our children. As you can tell, I affectionately called him our little boy. But my wife and I have been in West Texas pretty much our entire life. I grew up in a small town called Seminole, and my wife grew up in a small town called Kermit, which, if you don't know about those two small towns, total population for Seminole is 5,000. Total population for Kermit is about 6,000. So anytime y'all talk about how small your towns are, just if it's not in that 5,000 range, I don't want to hear it because it's just small town USA is where I'm from. And so as I mentioned, we are involved in the community. That's us doing soccer there on the left. That's my son there on the right. So this is a picture of us fishing earlier this spring. And that on the bottom right is actually the very first deer that my son ever killed last deer season. He is very excited about the fact that on his very first kill, he killed a 10-point buck, and Dad has never killed anything above an 8. And so he loves telling people about that. As Brent mentioned, we are a jiu-jitsu family as well. Here's some pictures of us at tournaments. There's my kiddo just a couple months ago. That on the top right corner is his very first medal. There's a picture of me at the Austin Open. We are just very involved in jiu-jitsu. It's very, very fun. It's something that we've really enjoyed doing, and I would love to tell you more about that because the funny thing about jiu-jitsu, it's kind of like what CrossFit was 10 years ago, which is the secret code is this. If you don't know anybody that does CrossFit, just get around somebody for a little bit and they'll happily tell you. It's like the old Fight Club rules. Fight Club was, there are no rules, just don't talk about Fight Club. CrossFit was the opposite of that. Everyone talks about CrossFit. Well, jiu-jitsu's that way now. So if you have any questions, want to talk about that, I'd be happy to share with you. But that's just a little bit about me. Before we jump into our topic, I just want to ask you all a question. And that question is this: How are you doing? Now, don't answer that, but just, how are you doing? The last 2 years have been tough. Pastoring in a post-pandemic world, thinking about the realities of COVID-19, thinking about the racial issues in our country, the political polarization. If you're like me, well, then many of us have been at times frustrated, overwhelmed, and unsure how to faithfully navigate amidst the tumultuous cultural waters that we find ourselves in. And you add to that the reality of a fast-changing culture when it comes to these issues of gender and sexuality. And it's understandable why many pastors and many church leaders want to leave the ministry altogether, because they look into the face of the cultural tide that is presenting itself to us and they find themselves saying, what in the world are we going to do? How are we going to navigate this? And it's easy sometimes to lose sight of what Jesus is doing or how Jesus is working amidst these things. In fact, you may read a study or a headline like what came out from the Gallup poll just back in February, in which it said that LGBT identification in the United States has ticked up to 7.1%. Don't miss that. What that means is that of individuals who are presently walking in the United States today, 7.1% of people now identify along the LGBTQ spectrum. Not only that, whenever you dig in a little bit deeper and you look at this at a demographic level, when you look at individuals who are associated with Gen X or those who were born between 1965 and 1980, those individuals identified as 4.2% of those individuals were on LGBTQ spectrum. But then you move on to my generation, Generation Y, those born between 1981 and 1996, and it quickly shot up to 10%. 10% of people in my generation, in Gen Y, the millennial generation, identify around the LGBTQ spectrum. And then today's young people, Generation Z, those born between 1997 and 2003, 20.8%. 1 in 5 of our young people would openly identify as LGBT. So you take all that together and you add in the other age demographics, and that's where we get 7.1%. And so again, I ask you, you look at that information and you think about how it fits into the context of our day, how are you doing? Because it can feel overwhelming and it can feel at times hopeless. And so before we really get started, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge something that many of you already know and feel. The present issues that we face in ministry are incredibly complex. In other words, when we think about these things, I think one of the worst things that I could do is look you in the face and say, here's the silver bullet. Here's the answer. Now, we all know that Jesus is the answer, and he's always going to be the answer. But figuring out how to communicate Jesus and minister into people's lives with the truth of Jesus, that's what presents itself before us. And the fact of the matter is there are no formulas. There is no, if you do this, then this will always happen. No, when we deal with people, there's always struggles and complexity. People are messy and difficult, just like all of us are. And so one of the things that I want you to know from the very, very beginning is before we leave this week, give yourself a ton of grace. Give yourself a ton of grace. Why? Because we're going to make mistakes as we try to figure this out together. We are the first generation of pastor leaders having to deal with this kind of sexuality and gender confusion in American history. Let me say that again. We are the first generation of pastor leaders dealing with this kind of sexuality and gender confusion in American history. That means that we are trying to blaze a trail, carve a path, and as a result of that, you know what that means? We're going to make some mistakes along the way. Thankfully, we serve a God who is big enough to cover our mistakes and who is sovereign enough to work out our mistakes for good. But we cannot think that we have to walk out with just this right recipe or this right formula, otherwise we're going to ruin people's lives. No, give yourself a lot of grace. Because my goals for this week are really simple. What I want to do this week is I want to equip you with the information that I can share and hopefully some good experiences that will speak to your heart. But I want to encourage you. I really do. I have been to church conferences and walked away thinking, man, well, unless I'm the guru, I'm in trouble. Unless I can say things like he did or like she did, then I guess I don't have any shot in the world. I do not want you to walk away from this week feeling that way. In fact, hopefully what you'll hear me say is that you already know how to do a lot of these things. You already have the tools and the resources and the message that you need, but maybe some extra information from me can just help and support your ministry endeavors in that regard. And so for our first session, we are asking the question, how did we get here? How did we get to a place in our cultural moment in which 7.1% of people identify as LGBT? But also, how did we get to this place in our cultural moment where it seems like Judeo-Christian ethics have become more and more, people are more and more resistant to them and do not have an inclination or a preference for them? Well, maybe it would be helpful to go all the way back to March 25th, 2015. Many of you remember whenever Bruce Jenner sat down with Diane Sawyer, and he did his interview on ABC. And he began to talk about how for the longest time he has struggled with his gender identity and began to talk about how he now identifies as Caitlyn Jenner and has always felt like he was really and truly a woman, but just trapped in a man's body. And here's how he said it. When God was looking down and making little Bruce, he said, let's give him all these wonderful qualities. But you know, everybody's got to have something to deal with. So what are we going to give him? I know, let's give him the soul of a female. My brain is much more female than it is male. It's hard for people to understand that, but that's what my soul is. For all intents and purposes, I am a woman. My heart and my soul and everything I do in life is this female part of me. I was not genetically born that way. And then Jenner went on to say this. What I am doing is going to do some good, and we're going to change the world. I firmly believe that we're going to make a difference in the world with what we're doing. Now, here's what's interesting. Bruce Jenner was not wrong. I mean, look what the world has been doing since 2015. Look how crazy and how fast the tides of cultural change have hit us. But what if the world had already changed before Jenner made this statement? As a matter of fact, what if the world had changed so much that a statement or the things that Jenner said 100 years ago would not have made sense to anybody? I mean, if you were to tell my grandfather's generation that I am a woman trapped in a man's body, they would look at you like there was something really, really wrong with you. In fact, they probably wouldn't even know what you're talking about. What do you mean you're a woman trapped in a man's body or a man trapped in a woman's body? They wouldn't have a category for that at all. So the real question is, how did we get to a place in which Bruce Jenner can say what he said and people understood what he meant? People actually resonated with this distinction between an inner soul that is female and an outward body that is male. How did we get to a place culturally where people have the categories in their minds to go, oh, I understand what he means by that? Whereas just 2 generations ago, nobody would have understood what that meant. And so that's what we're going to answer in this first session. How have we got to the place? What are the cultural and intellectual currents that have shaped the present day? And so to answer that question, we're going to look at a couple of things together. Number one is we're going to talk about the biblical sex ethic. And by the way, you should have a handout there at your table in which we're going to have some blanks that we will fill out together. Obviously, you can take your own notes as we go, but that handout is there for you if you would like to fill in the blanks as we go. Number two, we're going to look at the modern notions of identity, specifically what people think today when they answer the question, who am I? We're going to look at those modern notions and how they came to be in the present day. Number three is we'll look at the church's response. Specifically, we'll look at how the church has reacted to some of these things in recent history. And then number four, we'll talk about what we should do now. So, press pause real quick. This opening session is going to be very much at the high level, talking about some of the cultural and intellectual currents that have led to our present moment. The next session, we'll talk about transgenderism specifically, and tomorrow we'll talk about homosexuality in the church. And in those second and third sessions, we will talk more and more practically about how to navigate some of these things. And then in our final session, we will actually address some very specific, on-the-ground questions that many of us are facing, and then give you a chance to ask those questions as well. Sound good? Everybody still good? All right. Well, if you want to dig more into the subject that we're going to cover in this opening session, I cannot recommend enough the 2 books that Carl Trueman has come out with in the last couple of years. The one on the right is called The Rise and the Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a longer book that looks at this question of how we got here at much more depth. But the one on the left is actually a shorter book, 200 pages, written for pastors and leaders. It's called Strange New World. And that book is an incredibly helpful resource just to summarize and get to the point of answering the question. In many ways, the presentation that I'm going to give you this afternoon is a distillation of a lot of Trueman's work and some other people, but there's a lot of great information in Trueman's books. With that being said, let's do a review. Let's talk about what the biblical sex ethic is. And if we talk about the biblical sex ethic, we have to start with the Bible's view of the body. And there's no better place to go for that than Genesis chapter 1. I firmly believe that all good theology starts in Genesis. If you get Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 wrong, you get everything else in the Bible wrong. And so let's go to Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 26. And then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the livestock and the whole earth and the creatures that crawl on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. And then God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth." Now, obviously, there's a lot we could say about these three verses, but as it relates to the human body in particular, let's make a few observations. The first thing to note here is that God makes it clear we are deeply integrated beings. We are embodied souls and we are ensouled bodies. When God says that I'm going to make mankind in my image, he goes on to say that he's going to make them male and female. That is to say that sexual difference between the genders is a built-in part of God's creative design. It is woven into the fabric of creation. It is not part of the fallen world or the sinful nature that comes in Genesis chapter 3. In other words, the human body is part of God's revelation in creation. God is speaking to us about purpose and design and intention simply in the physical and anatomical structures of our body. And that means that it's not meant to be discarded or ignored when we think about moral decisions, when we think about what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, what we should not do. The body is a basic starting point for all people to know, even if they don't have access to the Bible or don't believe the Bible, when it comes to moral decision making. Now, of course, we all know the body is in fact affected by sin, but the original design of male and female remain intact. There's going to be, for many of us, there's going to be a time in which our bodies no longer metabolize food as effectively and as quickly as they used to. Many of us have gone through physical surgeries. Many of us have gone through physical challenges. Our body is affected by the broken world that we live in. And yet, even amidst those physical difficulties, the basic reality of male and female is a permanent feature of our physical design. And that means that the body is essential, not accidental, but essential to understanding human identity and human morality, who we are and what we should do. And that leads us to God's design for sex. God's design for sex flows out of, in some ways, God's design of the human body. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says this: "This is why a man will leave his father and mother, bond with his wife, and they will become one flesh. Both the man and his wife were naked, and they felt no shame." Now, it's important to note that Jesus quotes this verse when he refers to God's design for marriage. One of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow is how folks will often say, Jesus never mentioned transgenderism. Jesus never mentioned homosexuality. Well, not directly, no, but that doesn't mean we don't know what Jesus believed about these things. We know what Jesus believed about these things because he was a first century Jew operating with Genesis 1 and 2 in his theological and intellectual background. And so we know what Jesus believed about the human body and about human marriage. Not only that, but the Apostle Paul quotes this verse when he speaks about God's design for marriage. That's important because it means that when Jesus or the Apostle Paul are talking about marriage and human identity, they are not simply addressing their unique cultures. They're referring back to creation and God's creative intent for these things. So you could summarize in some ways the biblical sex ethic this way: that God's design for sex is one man, one woman, in marriage for life. Not only that, but God's design for sex is rooted in God's design for marriage. And finally, that God's design for marriage reveals Jesus' relationship to the church. That's a very three-point basic summary. When you look at that, though, it's really easy for us to go, yeah, there it is. Plain and simple. No problems, right? Oh, but there is a problem. You know what the problem is? We are all born with sexual sin and brokenness. All of us experience sexual sin and brokenness. And here's what that means practically. It means that all of us, because of our sinful nature, we are born with attractions, and then we live out behaviors that are contrary to God's original design for us. And these attractions and behaviors will often manifest themselves with the opposite sex, the same sex, or a mixture of both. That's important, because here's one of the things that means. It means that as Christians, as leaders, we can't just say, here's the biblical sex ethic, now go obey it to a lost and dying world. Because a lost and dying world doesn't know the message of the gospel yet that helps them deal with these broken attractions and desires. All they know is what they have personally experienced. And so, one of the things that we have to do is understand these things. And at the same time, when we talk about the Bible's sexual ethic, we have to have a robust understanding of the Bible's view of sin. And whenever we talk about the Bible's view of sin, and we talk about it in relationship to sex, we could say the following. We could say this, that while we are all created in God's image, that means we are uniquely respectable and valuable in God's sight, we are also born with a sinful nature, with an inner constitution that inclines our hearts and lives away from God instead of toward God. Because of this, Jesus and the biblical authors assume the presence of deeply felt attractions and desires that we must say no to. Let me say that again. The biblical authors assume that there are going to be things in our hearts that we deeply feel that will not be good for us, that will not lead to abundant life, and that as a result of that, we must say no to, even if we deeply feel them. And this also includes saying no to sexual desires, attractions, behaviors, etc., that are outside of God's design. So, if I were to summarize the biblical sex ethic, I would say that you need to have three key components: the human body, sex is reserved for marriage, and our sinful nature. Those are, if you will, some building blocks for understanding, but also for communicating to your people what the Bible teaches about these things. You realize, maybe this wasn't your experience. Here was what I was taught about sex whenever I was growing up in and around the church. Don't do it. Sex bad. Sex gross. But when you get married, golly, have as much fun as you want to. That's what I was told about sex. I didn't have a healthy or a robust view of how the human body factored into these things, why it was reserved for marriage, or how my sinful nature was at war within me to play into these things. I think, and what we have seen in some of our ministries at Stonegate, is that when we talk to people about sex and sin and place it within the context of God's design for marriage and human identity, it makes more sense, because now they understand the why and not just the what. They understand the good design and not just the bad consequences of living according to our own nature. So, big idea number one. I think here's a summary of the whole first section that maybe could be helpful for you. The Bible teaches both how God created us and how sin has distorted us. The Bible teaches both how God has created us and how sin has distorted us. I think both of these are going to be important for us to communicate in our discipleship to people, that it's both how God has created us and how sin has distorted us. So that covers the biblical sex ethic. Now we're going to have some real fun and talk about the modern notions of identity. That is to say, what is shaping how people today view themselves? Why can't they just see themselves as biological males or biological females? Why can't they just see themselves as created in God's image and yet broken by the fall? Why is there so much complexity? And even more than that, why is there so much authority that is given to the inner sense that people have about themselves as opposed to God's word and God's design? Well, we're going to answer that in this session. And we can look at, I think, two cultural development, specifically in the fields of psychology and philosophy. If we're going to understand how we got to the present day, there's a couple of key ideas. Now, again, we're not going to go into great depth on these, but these are some of the cliff notes of intellectual history that I think are helpful for us as we're thinking about how we got to a place where someone could say what Bruce Jenner said and people understood what he meant. Let's first talk about the fields of psychology. Did you know that prior to the mid-1800s, sexuality was primarily understood in terms of behavior? It was not understood as someone's identity. It was primarily understood as something you did, not something that you are. So think, for example, about how the Bible talks about same-sex relationships. It never says same-sex attraction. It says men who have sex with men, women who exchange natural relations for women in other natural relations or other unnatural relations. It always talks about these things in terms of actions and behavior, not in terms of psychological identity. As a matter of fact, prior to the 1800s, there was no single term to describe same-sex relationships. Prior to the 1800s, no one said, I am a homosexual. You are a homosexual. In fact, even heterosexual wasn't even used that much. And that all changed with one gentleman primarily. Anybody take a wild guess at who this gentleman was? Sigmund Freud. That's right. Sigmund Freud is the guy that changed everything for us. If you don't know who Freud was an Austrian neurologist and founder of modern psychoanalysis. He believed that sexual fulfillment was foundational to human happiness. That's key. And this was a major departure from previous notions of happiness. When you look at the ancient Greek tradition, when you look at the ancient Jewish tradition, and when you look at the Christian tradition, happiness was actually on the other side of living in accord with your nature. Think, for example, how many of you talk about, or how many of you have heard people talk about the importance of virtues in our culture today? We don't use that language anymore. You know why? Because virtues in almost every intellectual tradition prior to the present day were always understood as living in accord with one's nature, living in accord with one's design. And Freud said, nope, sexual fulfillment is the key to human happiness and flourishing. Here's how Freud put it. He said, man's discovery that sexual or genital love afforded him the strongest experiences of satisfaction and, in fact, provided him with the prototype of all happiness. This must have suggested to him that he should continue to seek the satisfaction of happiness in his life along the path of sexual relations, and that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life. Anybody want to put that on Twitter after the thing is over? It's a pretty striking statement. And remember, he's saying this in the late early 1900s. Really, he said this in 1930. Pretty crazy stuff. For Freud, human nature is deeply and irreducibly sexual. And because of that, he and his contemporaries were the very first ones to use the terms heterosexual and homosexual to describe people's sexual attractions. And for them, human sexuality was the core of human identity. Human sexuality was the core of human identity. So here we hear echoes of Freud today when someone says, this is just who I am. This is just who I am. Don't try to change me. This is just who. It's not just what I have. It's not just what I do. No. This is who I am. We can also talk about some currents in philosophy. In philosophy specifically, there are a couple of intellectual schools that are important to know about. Number one is the school known as Romanticism. It was the intellectual school of thought of the 18th and the 19th century. A lot of cool things come out of Romanticism, but there's a lot of bad things as well. We could talk a lot about Romanticism, but here's what you need to know. Romanticism was primarily a secular European philosophy that elevated personal feelings over human reason. It elevated personal feelings over human reason, and especially over divine authority, especially over the Word of God. The Romantics, they rejected the Christian doctrine of original sin, and they grounded morality in the natural dispositions of the human heart. And because of this, for the Romantics, the highest virtue, the most important thing that you can do with your life is self-expression. Self-expression. We hear echoes of Romanticism every time someone says, follow your heart. Do what feels right. Because there's an elevation, there's an authority that is given to human feelings over and against divine scripture or human reason. So the primary thinker here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and here's how he put it. The fundamental principle of all morality upon which I have reasoned in all my writings is that man is a being who is naturally good, loving justice and order, and that there is no original perversity in the human heart, and that the first movements of nature are always good. Now, we can give him a little bit of grace because he didn't live through 2020 and have a Twitter account, right? But think about this for a second. If you believe this, if you don't believe in original sin and you believe that the fundamental dispositions of the human heart are always good, of course you're going to believe your feelings are trustworthy. Of course you're going to believe that self-expression is the highest virtue because there's a God inside of you that needs to get let out. But if there is such a thing as original sin, if there is such a thing as a broken sexual nature, then maybe there's some other things to consider. Well, the second school of thought we can also attribute to our present day is not just romanticism, but we move out about 100 years to existentialism. Existentialism. This was another secular European philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, and they talked a lot about personal feelings, but they really elevated personal freedom over human reason. And they didn't mean personal freedom in the sense of like independence, like from a country. What they meant was the ability to do whatever you want to do. And so for them, they also rejected the Christian doctrine of original sin. They also went a step further. And for the existentialists, it's not just that there's no original sin. It's also that there's no human nature. There is no fixed human nature. Instead, they grounded morality in the expressions of the human will. That is to say, you decide who you want to be, you become who you want to be. You decide who you want to be, you become who you want to be. And that means that for the existentialist, the highest virtue, the most important thing you can do is live a life of authenticity. Of authenticity. How many times have we heard someone or one of our young people say, I just want to be true to myself. I just want to be authentic. Because for them to be authentic, notice how it's changed. If you were to ask the Apostle Paul, what does it mean to be authentic? First of all, he would say, what's that word mean? Secondly, he would say, well, it probably means being true to how God made me, to my design as an image bearer. He would look at his body, his gender. He would look at the divine word, the Genesis 1 and 2 realities. If you ask a modern person, what does it mean to be authentic? They would say, to do what I most feel is right. To never deny myself what I know to be true on the inside. Jean-Paul Sartre was a leading thinker here, and here's what he said. There is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself to be. And so finally, this leads, I think, culminating in the modern day into what we know as expressive individualism. Expressive individualism, in many ways, is the cultural climate that we live in today. It is the result of romanticism and existentialism and the psychological movement with Freud and his contemporaries. This term, though, is a relatively new term. It was coined by the sociologist Robert Bellah in 1996, and it basically just means that each person has a true self that needs to be expressed, and this self-expression is essential to human happiness, so much so that any kind of social conformity, for example, to one's family or community or one's religion, is seen as a threat. When somebody is working through the gender transition realities, when somebody is dealing with their own sexual attractions, they are oftentimes being told that their family or their church is a toxic family or a toxic church if their church or family does not affirm that transition or affirm those sexual attractions and desires. Why? Because of this. Because expressive individualism says you've got to be true to yourself even if everybody comes against you. And so, taken together, what does all this mean for us practically? It means that the people we are ministering to ultimately have the following understandings. That human identity for them, and for many of us even, has become radically individualized, sexualized, and emotionalized. That how we conceive of ourselves is primarily in terms of individual terms, sexual terms, and emotional terms, as opposed to gendered terms, biological terms, even family of origin terms oftentimes. Not only that, when you take this together, human identity is not something that we receive, but it's something we construct. Something we construct. And we'll especially see this in the next session with transgender identity. Number three, human sexuality is no longer what we have. No, it's who we are. You are a heterosexual. You are a homosexual. You are cisgender. You are transgender. These are all identity labels that flow naturally from these intellectual currents. And as a result of that, human purpose is no longer about becoming virtuous by aligning with our nature. No, it's about becoming authentic by aligning with our feelings. The younger generation, my generation really kind of did a lot of this, but especially Generation Z, their central goal in life is to be true to themselves by finding a cause or a mission that is worth giving their lives for. Now, what's interesting is that we have a message about what is a cause worth giving their lives and their ultimate identities for. The problem is they start at a place that says, if I cannot express all of the inner feelings and passions within me, then I cannot fulfill that mission. I cannot be who I am supposed to be because God has been taken out of the equation. Let me give you, I think, an exact maybe comparison that helps with this. So let me show you a picture real quick of Brent at his party today. I mean, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon warrior. This is let's just say, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon warrior. And this Anglo-Saxon warrior experiences two impulses very powerfully. Number one is aggression. He wants to go Wreck-It Ralph on everything. He wants to smash things, break things, bust things. He wants to be a warrior. He wants to do that. But the other impulse that he experiences is same-sex attraction. In his culture, which impulse will he be told that you should feed, and which impulse should he ignore and suppress? Well, in his culture, he should feed the aggression, and he should suppress the same-sex attraction. But now, let's compare this to your modern Manhattan urbanite. And he experiences the exact same two impulses, aggression and same-sex attraction. Which impulse should he feed according to his culture? And which impulse should he suppress according to his culture? His culture, our culture, the culture of modern expressive individualism, the culture after Freud, the culture after the Romantic and the Existentialist movement. His culture says you should feed same-sex attraction, express same-sex attraction, but the aggression needs to be suppressed. What does this show us? Well, Tim Keller is actually who came up with this illustration, and here's how he puts it. He says, despite protests to the contrary, we need some standard or rule from outside of us to help us sort out the warring impulses of our interior life. Where do our Anglo-Saxon warrior and our modern Manhattan man get their grids? From their cultures, from their communities, from their heroic stories. They are actually, bless you, not simply choosing to be themselves, ironically. No, they are filtering their feelings, jettisoning some and embracing others. They are actually choosing to be the selves that their cultures tell them they may be. You see how much these movements are... A lot of us think, man, those are just ivory tower intellectual ideas, but oh my gosh, how they have gotten into the modern minds of our people. How have they gotten into the modern minds of our people? Two words. You ready? Entertainment and education. Entertainment and education have been the vehicles through which these ideas have come into the modern day. Most people will go to their deathbed and having never read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But many people have seen the movies and the television shows or have been educated by the higher institutions or just have a YouTube account and have access to these things. In fact, when you look at our cultural moment, whether it is the movies that we have watched or it's the entertainers like Lady Gaga and Macklemore that our people listen to, these are the heroic people of our day. These are the poets. These are the ones who have such influence and command over the emotions. For me, I'll be honest with you. You know where this started for me? Not growing up in a Christian home, not growing up in church. You know what my first exposure to some of these things actually was? Will and Grace. Will and Grace. I loved Will and Grace whenever I was growing up. I loved watching this show because one of the things that it told me was that gay men are just like every other man, and that gay relationships are just as healthy as every other relationship. And there's no reason for me to think differently. Now, Is there a place for us to really honestly reevaluate how we have treated people in the homosexual community? Absolutely. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But one of the things that we have to be honest about is the fact that so many of the things that used to be considered deviant forms of sexual expression 200, 150 years ago, now, because of the cultural moment we live in and the way entertainment and education has shaped us, these things have now become normalized and celebrated. In fact, Joe Biden said it in 2012. I think Will and Grace probably did more to educate the American public than almost anybody's ever done when it comes to same-sex relationships. And so here's the second big idea, and then we'll go to a break here in just a moment. Second big idea I hope that you see from this session, this is the big thing to walk away with. Our cultural moment is the result of a massive collision between the biblical sexual ethic and modern notions of identity. If we are conservative, evangelical, Bible-believing Christians, we are coming from this place of the biblical sexual ethic, but our culture is coming from this place of the modern notions of identity. And then when those two things meet, we have our present moment. In fact, I love how Christopher Yuan says it in his book, Holy Sexuality and the Gospel. He says, the strong influence of these philosophies and movements on the Western culture produced a vacuum. A vacuum. And in the absence of any objective foundation for true human identity, experience essentially became God. Experience reigned supreme, and everything else had to bow before it. In such a climate, the idea that sexuality represents our core identity quickly took root. And so, we're going to talk about how our own local practical discipleship strategies can address these things in the remaining sessions. Did I get a good read on the room just now? Did some of y'all have some aha moments in that last session? You kind of go, okay, some of the things are making sense. Some of the things are kind of checking. You guys are seeing where some of these things are connecting. Good. Well, what I'm going to do now, this next part of our first session is not nearly as detailed as the last session was. But one of the things I want to let you know about is that I've seen many of you taking notes pretty viciously, and that's great. Two things. We're going to make the PDF of the slideshow available to all of you, first of all. And secondly, Brent's going to send you a $50 gift. I'm just kidding. When you're not part of the denomination, you can say whatever you want, right? No, the second thing is for real. When we first did some of the trainings on these things for our own church, we did these in the form of a workshop for our congregation and for our parents and leaders. And what you guys are hearing, especially in the next two sessions, the transgender talk and in the homosexuality talk, we have about 50 pages each of extra data and research that's been consolidated. That's more of the background stuff that goes into some of these points. We're going to send those to you guys as well, okay? And so we'll make sure that you guys have all of that. That's going to be available, and yeah. So, all right. Well, here's what we're going to do, okay? We're going to do, I think, probably one of the more difficult things for this session. What we've just talked about is what the Bible says. We love what the Bible says. But then we've just talked about what the culture is saying, and that gives us a whole lot of consternation. It's easy to just go, okay, well, the culture is crazy. Let's just go do our own thing. We can't do that, though. No, what we have to do is what David did in Psalm 139, where he says, search me, O God. Test me, O God. Search my heart and show me where there's been any unrighteous and unfaithful way within me. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how the church's response to some of these things hasn't always been the most helpful when it comes to navigating this cultural moment and dealing with these sorts of things. And so when we answer the question, how did we get here, what we just looked at is really part of the answer. Part of the answer is that our present cultural moment is the result of a cultural collision between the biblical sexual ethic and the modern notions of identity. The other part of the answer, though, that we could talk about is how the church has responded to these things, and we can look at two things in particular. Specifically, we can look at how the church at times, not in every case, but how the church at times has had a very graceless witness. But we can also talk specifically about something known as the reparative therapy movement, and we'll talk about what that means here in a moment. Let's talk first about this reality of graceless witness. Here's the fact of the matter. Many people who are coming of age right now in our present culture, and many people who are part of what you might call the broader LGBTQ community, when they think about the church and when they think about evangelical Christians, something like this is what comes to their minds. Now, here's the deal. You may completely distance yourself from this sort of approach and this sort of language, and I would as well, and I understand. And yet the cultural perception is one in which to be a Christian is to be associated with somebody who just hates gay people or just hates somebody who's different than us. I was talking to somebody just earlier today, and they made the really good observation that it's really, really easy to look at somebody that we don't identify with and then villainize them because we don't have the same struggle that they do until it comes into your house or until it comes into your church. And so we got to be honest and say that, there may have been a time in which you could stand on the corner and just preach to somebody and you get mass results from that. I'm definitely not against preaching on the corner, but here's what I know. I know that my generation and the generation after me especially, they don't just want to hear the truth. You know what they want to hear? They want to hear that we love them and care about them first. As a matter of fact, most people in my generation and the one coming up after me, they really don't care what we have to say unless they first know that we care about them first. And so the fact of the matter is, I'm not asking any of us, and I'm not advocating that any of us for a second change the message of the gospel. But I am asking that maybe in light of recent past, we consider how can we communicate our love for people with grace and compassion by asking about their stories, by asking about their experiences, before we start sharing the truth with them. Because if we don't help create a home for the truth to land in, it will always fall on deaf ears. So, we see this, I think, in other examples. You can look, for example, at the Barna study that was done in 2015, what millennials, my generation, want when they visit the church. And here's what the study found. It found that a significant number of young adults have deeper complaints about the church. For example, 35% they have complaints about moral failures in the leadership. 87% said that Christians are judgmental. 85% said that Christians are hypocritical. 70% said that Christians are insensitive to others. And here's the kicker. 91% said that Christians are anti-homosexual. In fact, in his book, The Anatomy of Deconversion, John Marriott, who looks at the present deconversion or deconstruction crisis that's been happening in our culture as of late, he interviews several people and does some case studies, and here's what he found. That a disproportionate number of deconversions have in common a similar type of Christian background. Repeatedly, deconversion stories exhibit aspects of fundamentalism. What does he mean by fundamentalism? A church culture that is not open to questions, struggles, or the messiness of following Jesus in a broken world. Fundamentalism, in other words, is oftentimes characterized by a really, really dogmatic emphasis on the truth at the expense of grace. And here's what he went on to say. While some former Christians testify that their home and church experiences were gracious, loving, and life-giving, the vast majority do not. On the contrary, more often than not, they have little good to say about their time as Christians. Words such as strict, narrow-minded, legalistic, and fundamentalist were commonly ascribed to their Christian experience. Do you know anybody who thinks that way or has that perception toward the church at large? Now, here's a question. What do we do about that? Here's what we need to know. We can't overcorrect in light of this kind of data. Some people overcorrect and jump ship to progressive Christianity. That's not the right move. Because some of this cannot be helped. No, the scriptures are clear. The message of the cross will always be offensive to some people. The scriptures say it very clearly that we are all sinners, and that is an offensive message. And the reality is that there are going to be some people that we just can't persuade them because they don't want to be helped with the message of Jesus. We cannot win everyone. And if people are coming to us, hopefully, if they want to become members or whatever the case may be, they already have some sort of awareness of what we believe about these things or would say about these things. But by and large, I think we have to be honest with the fact that in an increasingly hostile culture that is hostile to the gospel, we're going to experience more and more of what Paul said when he said that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. And at the same time, while the gospel is offensive, we should not be. While the gospel is offensive, we should not be. Paul said that we should do everything we can to live at peace with those in our midst. In other words, we must do everything we can to be like Jesus, who is full of grace and full of truth. I think that Satan would love for us to fall off of one side of the horse or the other. He doesn't care which side, just fall off. If we fall off on the side of truth, which I think a lot happens in the fundamentalist cultures, is we get so dogmatic about our doctrine and our ethics and those sorts of things, and those things matter. Those things are super important. But sometimes we fall off the side of the horse that says all truth, and I'm going to compromise on grace. But progressive Christianity does the exact opposite. It's all about the grace with no truth. It is all about being accepting and affirming and inclusive, but it misses the truth of the gospel that actually sets people free from their sins. We've got to walk down the middle path, follow Jesus. So that's a little bit about graceless witness. What is the reparative therapy movement? Well, as a friend of mine who's a lesbian told me, the reparative therapy movement is essentially the movement that taught people you could pray the gay away. And as she recommended to me, I will recommend to you, if you haven't seen it yet, hop on Netflix whenever you get home and watch this documentary called Pray Away, in which you will get an inside look into many of the different things that took place within the reparative therapy movement from the leaders themselves. Now, this is made with an agenda, right? This documentary has a secular agenda to it. You're not watching this to walk away and go, I believe and affirm all the things that I just listened to or watched. No, it's to get an inside look into the perception our culture has about the church right now, to understand how they see us, not just getting them to see what we want, but understanding where they're coming from. Let's get in more detail. What is the reparative therapy movement? Well, the reparative therapy movement was a movement primarily in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that really sought to help people experience a conversion in their sexual orientation, specifically from gay to straight. So you could think, for example, about organizations like Exodus International and some of the affiliated organizations that were connected to them. And this is oftentimes called the ex-gay movement. People that were in the movement, leaders that were in the reparative therapy movement would get platformed, and here's what would happen. Someone would come to them with same-sex attraction, and then they would go through the therapy, or they'd go through the counseling, or they'd go through whatever the program was, and then they would now say, I'm no longer gay. God has set me free from this. God has delivered me from this. And they would be called the ex-gays. As a matter of fact, many of them would get married to someone of the opposite sex, and these leaders and individuals would get put on television shows and networks and radio interviews and all sorts of things. They would identify as ex-gays. In the reparative therapy movement at large, there was over 700,000 people who were ministered to with some kind of homosexual orientation. But here's what you should know. Today, almost all of the leaders from this movement support LGBTQ plus relationships, and they believe that reparative therapy caused more harm than good. It's an interesting and sobering reality. Not only that, what we need to know is that whenever we think about that, that is a recent memory of how the church ministered to people within the homosexual community. As a result of that, when we minister to people today, we have to be honest that for some people who are familiar with that, the legacy of this movement hangs over the Christian witness today. And that's why many of them will say, you can't pray the gay away, because that was already tried, and it was not effective, and it was not successful. In fact, many LGBTQ people have this in the back of their minds when we talk to them about change or transformation. So how often in our messaging in church do we talk about how Jesus can transform your life, how Jesus can change everything for you? For someone with same-sex orientation or a same-sex attracted lifestyle, they may hear that and go, are you saying he can make me straight? Because the church tried that, and it didn't work. In fact, the big idea for them is, I didn't choose this, I can't change this, and I shouldn't have to. That's where they're coming from. In fact, you can think, for example, about Macklemore. The song that he came out with several years ago called Same Love really speaks for the gay community at large. He said this: the right wing conservatives think it's a decision, and you can be cured with some treatment and religion, man-made, rewiring of a predisposition. But I can't change even if I tried, even if I wanted to. Macklemore himself does not identify as homosexual, but he wrote this song on behalf of the gay community, coming out of or seeing this sort of ministry from the church. Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, okay, time out, Josh. But isn't this kind of change possible? Maybe you're even thinking of some people who were ministered to within the reparative therapy movement. Maybe you're thinking about even up close and personal experiences. Maybe you went to a conference 20 years ago. I'm not sure. Isn't this kind of change possible? And the answer to that question is an absolute and emphatic yes. It is possible. God can heal anyone of any kind of brokenness, no matter what it is, whether it is physical, sexual, emotional, or whatever. As a matter of fact, there are even some reported cases of this happening. There are some reported cases of individuals who had an exclusively same-sex attraction who were ministered to in this movement, and they did come out on the other side with a permanent heterosexual attraction to their spouse or whatever the case may be. But the vast majority of cases of people who had a good, positive experience with the reparative therapy movement at large, it wasn't so much that their same-sex attraction went away, it was that they walked away from a gay lifestyle. The attractions remained, but they learned how to follow Jesus and submit their attractions and brokenness to him in a journey of discipleship. Not only that, the most healthy and successful ones were the ones that were able to get connected to local church communities. And so when I think about this sort of thing, I think here's some language. Here's some language that might be helpful for all of us when we think about this kind of ministry. Is this kind of change, a change from one attraction base to another, is this possible? Yes, it is possible. But while it is possible, it is not promised. While it's possible, it's not promised. That is to say, Scripture does not promise that we will experience an end to our sexual brokenness in this life. We will not experience an end to our broken sexual desires and attractions in this life. Oh, that day is coming. And oh my gosh, it's going to be great when we get there. But that life is not here yet. That's the new heaven and the new earth. That is not the present world. And so we all have to, I think when we communicate to people within this space, we have to be upfront and acknowledge that we all have our crosses to bear and we all have our thorns to endure. So, what can we do? Well, I think that going forward, as we think about the multitude of complexities associated with the gender and sexuality confusion of our day, I think we have to do a couple of things. I think, number one, we must remain committed to the biblical sexual ethic. You know why? Because we can't love anybody better than God can. And God has given us the biblical sexual ethic in His Word. We're not more loving than God is. And so if we really want people to experience truth and freedom the way they were designed to experience it, then we have to encourage and teach and counsel toward this end. But not only that, we must be very aware of how the modern notions of identity are forming the default assumptions for most of our people. When they come into our church, especially from a secular background, their default assumptions are not the biblical sexual ethic. It's these modern notions of identity. And at the same time, I think we must be incredibly sensitive to the perceptions and the experiences of people about the church. That is to say, we can't just emphasize our messaging and what we want them to know. We also have to be very sensitive to what they already think, feel, and believe about the church, and then try to build a bridge and meet them halfway. Finally, I think, ultimately, this enables us to interpret and respond biblically. interpret and respond biblically. I don't know how many of you have been on the mission field before. I've personally never been an overseas missionary, but when I've talked to our missionaries, here's one of the things they talk about. They talk about how important it is to understand the context and the culture of the people that you are going to be ministering to. And so I want you to imagine for a second, I want you to imagine that you were not born and raised in the United States. I want you to imagine that you were not born and raised in Texas or wherever it is that you're from. Imagine for a second that you are from another country. Heck, let's just imagine that you're an alien from another planet for all I care. Doesn't matter. And you are being sent on an assignment to minister to 21st century secular, post-Christian, post-COVID America. What are the things that you need to know about the people? What are the experiences that you need to take into account? What has been their church experiences, their church background, their impression of religious communities at large? What are the idols of their age? What are the things they are giving their lives and their devotion to? I think that as pastors and as leaders, we have to increasingly approach these sort of things as a missionary who's sent into a people who are lost and in need of the gospel. In fact, for many of us, for many of you, that's exactly what you've been doing. But that needs to be, I think, all the more pressing in front of us. This enables us, I think, to interpret biblically. Here's a couple of things that we can do. That means, number one, we can reclaim the role of the human body in the formulation of human identity. That is to say, whenever we talk about discipleship, when we talk about identity, now we're going to start talking about the human body in more intentional and robust terms. We're going to talking about the goodness of God's design for gender. Here's how I say it to my son, buddy. God made you on purpose and for a purpose. Your gender is not an accident. It is intentional. Not only that, but I think we have to maintain this distinction between original design and inherited brokenness. How God created us and then how we're born because of our sinful nature. And then I think this will enable us to emphasize the true identity that God has given people as His image bearers. That is to say, I think that going back to Genesis chapter 1, I think the truth that all God's people are created in the image of God, this imago Dei doctrine, I think is going to be and is one of the most important doctrines to emphasize in our discipleship and in our teaching ministries in the church today, because the secular culture with its modern notions of identity has completely and totally walked away from any of those notions. And it's those sorts of things, what the doctrine of the imago Dei teaches us, that gives us so many resources to say, hey, you want to feel loved? I understand, because God made you on purpose. You are worthy of love and respect and dignity. Hey, you have difficulties with your gender identity? I understand that, because God made you one way, but there's this thing called sin and brokenness that came a couple chapters later. I think that if we don't just start with a person's sinfulness, but start with them being created in God's image, then we have the reference points that we need to help them and to help us interpret these situations correctly. And then, of course, that enables us to respond. I think this means that we respond by including sexuality and gender within our discipleship efforts. So, when I was growing up, parents were not encouraged to talk about sex with their kids until, what? When they were 13, 14, 15, maybe 35? I'm not sure. It was usually much later. I had to have the talk with my son at 5 because his cousin has an iPad with a YouTube channel, and there was naked girls on the YouTube channel that my 5-year-old son had seen. Anybody else have that experience? You don't got to raise your hand. But we understand, and our people that we're ministering to, and parents and teenagers, same sort of thing. And so we better get comfortable with those uncomfortable conversations, and we'll have some language to give you about that in the next sessions. But I also think we have to strive to create an atmosphere of grace and compassion so that when people walk into our churches, they don't just know what we believe, but they also know how we feel about them. And how we feel about them is, we love you. We're so glad you're here. I love the language that EFCA uses. We are welcoming but not affirming. I think it's wonderful, great language. And then I think ultimately we have to engage the mess. We have to engage the mess. It is messy. It is difficult. There is not this one-step formula. There is not this silver bullet. We have to be honest and be willing to help people surrender and submit to Jesus regardless of their struggle. But I want you to think for a second, real quick, about that last point. In fact, I want you to look at those last 2 points, creating an atmosphere of grace and compassion, and then engaging the mess so that people can surrender and submit to Jesus. Have you already been doing that in your churches before the gender and sexuality came up? Have you already been doing this with those who have alcohol addiction, pornography addiction? You already know how to do this. You already know how to do this. So, what I would encourage you to know is that regardless of what you take away from this week, I hope the information is helpful, but you do not need a guru to tell you how to disciple or minister to your people. No, you just need Jesus. Because our way forward is the way of basic Christian discipleship. The culture has changed, but the message of the gospel has not. Our way forward is the way of basic Christian discipleship. And Jesus said it this way: if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For many of our modern people, taking up their cross will mean saying no to same-sex attraction. It'll be saying no to their struggles with gender identity, embracing the biological reality that God has created them with. But they're going to need pastors, and they're going to need leaders, and they're going to need church communities to help them do that. A friend of mine once told me that we tend to adopt the beliefs of those who love and accept us the most. And friends, if we could help our people that are struggling with these things, or our culture that is struggling with these things, know that we love them and we accept them the most. But there's a message here about cross-bearing and about life-giving following Jesus that is so much better for them that maybe, just maybe, we can make a dent in the cultural moment, but more importantly, we can help people experience transformation. I'll leave you with this. Sam Alberry, who is a same-sex attracted man who's a pastor in the UK, I think he puts it really well. He says this: the cost of discipleship looks high for those coming to faith from an LGBTQ plus background, but that must not disguise the fact that the cost of discipleship is high for everyone. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The key word there is anyone. Because to follow Jesus, all of us will have to say a deep and profound no to some of our deepest intuitions and longings. And there will be times when it feels like obedience to him is taking life from us. And yet the glorious paradox is that by going through this loss, we are actually gaining life. That by denying self, following Jesus, we don't become less of who we are. We become most truly ourselves. So, friends, I know that the present moment can feel very, very overwhelming. And how we got here is a crazy story. But at the same time, how we got here is not as important as how we go forward. And you know how we go forward? We follow Jesus. We take up our crosses. We follow him. And then we do everything we can to help people in this gender and sexuality confusion do the exact same thing. And over the next few sessions, we'll talk more in detail about how that looks, but that's where we're going.